Good morning. So we're in behavioral neuroscience. Today we are going to talk about the limbic system, the amygdala specifically, the hypothalamus. I'm going to tie it into a couple of Greek myths, and we're going to talk about attachment styles, some of the literature on attachment styles that we covered in previous classes, but I'll tie it into today. And then I'm going to give you a little bit more mythology and then tie that into astrology and your moon sign and attachment styles. So that's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to share a PowerPoint with you in a moment, but what I want to do just for a second is remind you of what we covered on Tuesday. So I shared with you the myth of Athena. And it was Metis, the Titan, who was pregnant with Athena. Zeus was told that he was going to be dethroned. He swallowed Metis, and then from his head, Athena was born with the help of Hephaestus. So I just want to recap this because I linked it to three main aspects of the brain: the reptilian brain, the limbic system, which is what we're going to cover today, and of course the neocortex, which is more of the thinking brain. And then the symbolism of Hephaestus cracking open Zeus's head is that beyond the rational intellectual mind, we need some imagination or curiosity about the spiritual world, or expanding our knowledge into wisdom through seeking spirituality or something. So I want to recap that because today we're going to talk a little bit about the limbic system. So in that particular myth, and I'm going to share a few more myths with you today, in that particular myth, Zeus swallowing Metis is a super important component. The moon, the emotions, swallow us, okay? And I'm going to tie that into today. Our emotions consume us. Our emotions keep us in child. Our emotions, when we don't behave rationally, is usually when there's emotional behavior involved. In my model, I told you that there's 4 steps to subconscious development. First is obviously the moment of conception. Second is pregnancy. We're going to talk about that today, what happens in the brain structure, as well as attachment styles. And then, of course, the birth story, and then the 0 to 7 story. So today we're going to focus on the subconscious development, that piece related to pregnancy, this dysfunction of love that we get, the Costco membership card, and of course, moving into the Nordstroms, which is our healthy love, self-love, and I'll refer back to unconditional love and self versus selfish and all the terms that you've heard me we talk. So one of the things I just want to mention briefly about that Zeus part of the story, the limbic system part of the story, is that Zeus swallowed Metis, okay? So this part of us, this emotional aspect, swallows us. The other thing is this idea that I have of dethroning your parents. When we try to actually shift the pattern, and we actually try to swallow our parents, so to speak, so that we can dethrone them, what happens is and I told you that last week, and today I'll tie it in again, we actually punish ourselves and we go back to the emotion, we go back to the subconscious pattern of how our parents loved us unhealthily, and we punish ourselves. And so trying to switch that mechanism is very, very difficult. And I'll refer back to that today. So that's my goal for today. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see this? The limbic system, amygdala, and hypothalamus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Greek gods. I told you a moment ago about Zeus and Athena. I'm going to share a couple more Greek myths with you today. A little bit about brain development, attachment style linked to that, some metaphysical laws, and then moon signs, and of course wrap it up with all of it together through our conscious mind and what we can do to actually not let our emotions or our limbic system swallow us. So first I want to start with what the amygdala is. The amygdala is an almond-shaped set of neurons located deep in the brain's medial temporal lobe. And this is funny because back in the day when I really didn't know, not that I know much now, but when I didn't really know biology or physical structures, I always used to tell my kids subconsciously was in the back of their head. And I would say, bring it from the unconscious to the conscious. And I would sort of tap the back of my neck, and then I would tap the forehead. And as I learned, of course, more, realizing that what I was referring to, I guess, in my limited consciousness, was this idea of the amygdala. And it's in the temporal lobe. And it chose to play a key role in the processing of emotions. This is super important because that's the lecture today and what keeps us in child, what we talked about last week. The amygdala forms part of the limbic system. So this is that part that I talked to you about the moon and Mars in terms of astrological planets. I talked to you about the concept of Zeus swallowing Metis. So a little bit about mythology and almond trees. I always like to refer back to myth because it gives us some insight and maybe just a mnemonic for you to remember. So there's two particular myths that I want to share with you. One is of Phyllis. She was the queen of Thrace, and her lover was sent off to war, and she never felt that he was going to come back. So in despair, she commits suicide. And I underline despair because this is one of the emotions that we do connect to when we lose a love, when we lose the love of our parents, when we realize in our shattered snow globe that we were not loved unconditionally. There's this feeling of despair. The gods looked down at her and realized that she sacrificed herself, and they turned her into an almond tree. The symbolism there is sacrifice. There's going to be particular signs that are linked to this, but this is sort of the victim, the martyr, the rescuer archetype. People that feel that love is sacrifice and they have to sacrifice their own life for their children. They have to sacrifice for their lover. That whole nonsense that we talked about before is linked to this. And again, the almond tree is obviously the amygdala, and the gods, the Greeks, knew this. When her lover returns from war, he embraces the tree, and the tree blossoms beautifully. That's the picture. And becomes the symbol for constancy and love and eternal hope. And this is something I'm going to talk about more in my talk on Saturday, the return home. So this idea of dethroning your parents, honoring them, but not letting them run your kingdom. We have to return home. We have to realize that we cannot separate from our parents, that we really don't change too much from what our parents taught us, but we do need to shift a bit so that we can own our own life. The second myth I'd like to share with you is of a nymph named Nana. And she used to gather almonds from the tree and she would store them in her bosom. One day the almonds disappeared. She became pregnant with a child. In another version of the story, we see that there was a castrated being, and that castration fell into her lap, and she was pregnant with the almond tree. So either version of the story. This child that she birthed was named Attis, which she abandoned after birth. And Attis later on in the story castrated himself. And this is a really poignant story because mothers feel that they can't abandon their children. There's a specific attachment style we're going to talk about today where we feel abandoned in love or fear of abandonment. This is something I see a lot in practice with couples and with individuals. And castration is a theme that I've told you about over and over again in mythology, being castrated. We castrate ourselves and limit the love that we can give ourselves based on the parental definition of love that we learn in pregnancy. So there's a lot of mythology, a lot of symbology in these myths that we're going to refer back to today. So just to recap, I've told you before my 4-part subconscious development theory. Moment of conception, you're given your story. In pregnancy is where you're given your dysfunctional version of love. I'll go into that in a moment. 3rd step is birth, and then the 4th step is the 0 to 7. Today we're going to focus a bit on pregnancy and then a link to the baby in the 0 to 7 and then through adulthood. So in pregnancy, whatever your mother is going through emotionally will turn into your moon sign, will turn into your definition of love, dysfunctional because it's not healthy, and will turn into your attachment style. So for instance, if your mother has to work a lot, she has to work, she has no choice, she has to pay the bills, you may have a moon in Capricorn. Work, 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 hard work, duty. Those are the themes of the pregnancy. On the surface, it doesn't seem that that's a problem to work a lot till your last day of pregnancy. However, the child interprets this as the definition of love. And then perhaps he or she will only see love as work, as duty, and a relationship then becomes hard work. So you start seeing the themes of how that can weave into the person's life. It can turn into a value system and a judgment as well. Like in the myths I shared with you, emotions are untrustworthy. We cannot trust our emotions. We need them, and there are times that we trust them. In my book, I talk the difference between feelings and emotions. Feelings are fully processed. Emotions were sort of stunted because there was a judgment attached to them. So we want to honor our feelings. Our emotions are untrustworthy. The emotional center of the brain in the cerebrum begins at 5 weeks of pregnancy. So from the moment of conception, we've already gotten sort of our story. At 5 weeks of pregnancy, this sort of emotional center starts to develop. This dysfunctional version of love is what you will fight for your whole life. This is where you try to achieve your needs. I told you last week that the moon in our chart and the moon in the sky changes faces. And whatever face you change, whatever manipulation technique you have to do in order to get your needs met is how you will go through life until you start to control yourself and meet your own needs. The pregnancy is directly related to the attachment style you have as a child that leads to attachment style you have as an adult in your adult relationships. And the moon sign, of course, is linked to all of this. So a little bit about brain development, astrology, and then, of course, metaphysical law. So this is from several articles. This is not my language, and I've shared the references for you down below. At birth, the newborn baby is in a transitional stage of development with almost adult number of neurons, but an immature set of connections, stable neuron numbers from cradle to grave. These numbers of neurons are from the moment of conception. In my book, here it says cradle, so let's say birth, to the moment you die. We talked about that. As we evolve, those neurons become less immature and more specificity, which hopefully aligns with our maturity level as well. I'm going to link this in a moment to astrology and law of rhythm in metaphysics. During the first few months after birth, there is an overproduction of synapses accompanied by a process of synaptic elimination and stabilization, which lasts until adolescence. A few weeks back, I gave you a lecture about the law of rhythm, the 0 to 100, the ages, and the neutralizer that I call. Key in the law of rhythm is ages 14 to 16. This is adolescence. This is when you're supposed to stabilize. This is when you're supposed to look at your parents' value system and you're supposed to say, yeah, mom and dad, I believe in some stuff, but I don't believe in all of it. This is the little leaving home, so to speak, that begins at adolescence. When your child says, drop me at the corner, I'm embarrassed for my friends to see you. They start going to their friend's house and getting parents' advice when it's the same advice you've told them your whole life. This is the child's attempt to individualize, to eliminate all of mom, dad, and become some sense of self. This is also happening in the brain. Remember, the body is the loyal servant to the psyche. All of these things have been written hermetically, metaphysically, spiritually, and trickle down to the earth element of the body. So everything that I've been teaching you about the elements and the elemental structure also happens from the brain as well. Myelination begin prenatally, but is not completed until the third decade in the frontal cortex, where the highest executive function and conscious thoughts take place. This is astrology 101. This is law of rhythm 101. These cycles. Every 28 to 30 years, we have Saturn. Saturn means executive function. Saturn means an adulting process. It goes back to the adult phase in my model, the symbol of the square in symbology, and this is happening in the brain. What starts at 14 to 16, midpoint of 28 to 30, is adolescence. We start to neutralize, step away. By 28 to 30, if you remember my lecture a few weeks ago, we should fully have left home. This is astrologically when we get a mortgage, we get married, we have a baby, we become the boss. Something happens in our life in alignment with this brain development. So this is all on point of the elements in the order of air, fire, water, and earth. It's symbolic of the chakras, it's symbolic of astrology, it's symbolically of hermetic, and the brain follows this same development. Oxytocin. So I want to talk a little bit about oxytocin. This hormone has gotten a lot of attention. It's the love hormone, the cuddle hormone. You can see in my picture, there's a big heart connecting all of the molecular structure. So the oxytocin in the limbic system is composed of the hypothalamus, the amygdala that we talked about, the thalamus, and the hippocampus. Today we're talking primarily about the amygdala and the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces oxytocin. Again, limbic system is the Zeus, is the swallowing, is the emotion, is the moon, is the Mars. So that's why I use the word what we fight for in terms of our love definition, because moon is love and Mars is fight. So maternal love and romantic love coincide. This is where we see the attachment style of mom to baby and romantic love when we're trying to seek that same definition of love, unhealthy, in our adult relationships. So what are the pros of oxytocin? Oxytocin is a hormone that's released when the mother is having the baby for contraction so that it stimulates labor. It also helps sperm motility. It's released during breastfeeding. It triggers a bond between mother and infant. And it's also released upon sexual arousal when we meet someone that we like, that we're attracted to. It's oftentimes called the hug hormone or the cuddle hormone. So it's directly related to feelings of love, feelings of maternity. We cannot separate romantic love from maternal love. The moon sign is in the chart. This is hormonally in the body. So what are some of the cons? I've told you about the principle of polarity. I have an entire theory about the 0 to 100, the 48 to 52. The con of oxytocin, according to Dedrew, says that this is also responsible, so this is the dark side, if you will, of the hormone, for envy and socialization in terms of a negative way. Human ethnocentrism. Your group is better, your group is superior, other people are not as good. this is bias, this is ethnocentrism. Yes, you can develop trust within the group, but what happens to anybody that is considered other? Okay, much has been written about this other aspect in ethnocentrism. We're not going to cover that extent today, but just know that this does exist when we have this sort of version of love, or when we have this oxytocin. So in certain groups that we belong to, where we're hugged or cuddled, maybe not physically, but metaphysically or metaphorically, this oxytocin is released and we feel part of a group. But that can also be what is triggering us again, the moon and Mars. The moon and Mars, like all planets, like everything, has certain levels of consciousness. It could be how you fight for love, for your children, and you're the bear cub and you're fighting for no one to harm your child. That's great. But what if you're harming others because you want to defend your stance so much? This is also related to the 14-year-old or the 16-year-old that wants to push you away, that wants to fight with you. It could be another version of explaining adolescent storm at a more mild level. So the love drug or the cuddle chemical suggests that oxytocin has a role in the emergence of intergroup conflict and violence. So think of what happened last year with riots, with things in the election. This is all related to that. If you find a leader or a group that you pertain to, you might really not act in the best interest. You might be living from the limbic system, from the emotion, and not excuse me, hold on one second. I lost my share. Share screen, share audio, share. Okay, so you may be making decisions on a group mentality rather than logic, like the neocortex. The principle of polarity is in metaphysics, two sides of the same coin, the love-hate. We've all heard that there's a fine line between love and hate. You love someone for many years, you get divorced or you break up, and all of a sudden you hate them. This is all related to oxytocin. So what role does oxytocin play when we dethrone our parents? So if we understand that brain development links to this, by 14 to 16, we should step away from our parents. We should begin the individuation process as per Jung. By 28 to 30, Jung also stated that individuation process is part of our life's journey, right? To individuate, to move away, so to speak, from mom and dad, to differentiate those cells, if you will, from a brain language standpoint. And my language is moving away from parents or leaving home, as mythology, states. Dethroning our parents, what does oxytocin play a role in? So oxytocin makes us feel safe and calms the fear center of the brain. So I was telling you the other day, when you dethrone your parents, when you decide to do something different, when you decide to change the value system, when you decide to pursue a different career path, a different lover, a different value system, whatever it is, the way that you're dethroning your parents, you feel very, very nervous that you're going to lose that Costco membership, that version of love that you got at conception through 0 to 7, the dysfunctional version of love. All of a sudden, your body reacts and goes into shock and fear and, oh my God, and what am I going to do? And you've got two choices. You can show up logically as the adult. This is not happening to me right now. I am not 2 years old. I'm not going to not get love or fed or nourished or taken out of the crib or changed or, lose the roof over my head, because that's where we go. We go to that fight or flight response. We go to that fear. And that's one of the big reasons why we don't dethrone our parents. So I'm calling it the loyals to the royals. If you're loyal to the royals, your mom and dad, you never dethrone them. You never become an adult. You stay in child perpetually. And you go back to what you know as love, the bad buckets, poor coping, self-destructive behavior. I use the example with me of the Coke or the Diet Coke, and instead I channeled it through pink nail polish. So these seem like silly things, but it's really these small shifts, these small decisions. And I've told you always, you're just helping your client. If you even help your client, they're the ones doing the work. You give them a tiny small step, a tiny small erection to the box that they wear. We're really not shifting these huge things. Tiny shifts create huge momentous changes in our life. Okay, if we stop to take a breathe, that pause, that breath between the inhale and the exhale, I've said is where God lives, that can create a really big space in our life for change and showing up for the adult. Okay, so we tend to not want to dethrone our parents for fear of losing this dysfunctional love. Oxytocin, we want that love, that cuddle hormone. But the flip side of it is that we're self-destructive. It goes back to that we're honoring the group, aka your parents, your royals, and you don't dethrone them to become the king of your kingdom. So I have this image of Nala and Mufasa in The Lion King, and Simba was just born. Simba, as you know, eventually has to dethrone his parents. Oftentimes, in this case, it was when Mufasa died, but he didn't want to. He hid out with Timon and Pumbaa, wanting to pretend that he wasn't king. You are king, and you have to own your throne, but there's so much fear to do that parents will be mad, that we'll lose this limited version of love, and this oxytocin plays a big role in it. So going back to the myth of Hephaestus, I told you Hephaestus was ugly, and Goho, and he was kicked out of Olympus. And that's our fear. That's our fear, that we're going to get kicked out of Olympus. So we keep honoring this dysfunctional attachment style version of love, the group values, even though they're no longer our values. So I had a client this week who we were doing this work, and she's like, the minute I dethroned my parents, I went to have cheap wine and cookies, because her coping mechanism, self-destructive tendency, that's going to be found in your buckets. Your parents have already given you the unhealthy coping mechanism. In my case, it was also food. My mother would eat M&Ms and Coke. Luckily, she was thin. It didn't affect her, quote unquote, but it affected me. So you already know your poor coping mechanism and your self-destructive behavior, because that's what your parents did. You're not different from them. So she chose cheap wine and cookies. That was her coping mechanism, because the minute you dethrone your parents or try to, that kicks in and you go to a self-destructive tendency. That's what you're going to help your client realize. Okay, you stood up for yourself. You went against your parents' values. You're honoring your own group rather than their group, whatever it looks like in your client's life and in your life. Watch how the psyche will show up, how the self-destructive tendency, because it will show up. It might be in hours, minutes, days, or weeks, but it will be a direct relationship to that dethroning. And then that self-destructive behavior will show up. At that moment, of course, if you use the Athena, if you use the neocortex, the rational decision-making based on adult choices, based on the executive function of the frontal lobe, if you say, okay, I'm using my rational mind, I don't need to self-destruct, I'm not 2 years old, my parents aren't going to not love me, etc., then you can take a breath, feel calm, have self-love, and show up for yourself in a higher version of love, which I'll talk about more in a moment, is your good buckets and the self-love. So attachment styles. Attachment styles begin during pregnancy, okay? Immediately, the mother and the baby bond. In my theory, it's at conception, but let's use pregnancy. However, it continues during infancy, and there's actually research that the brain of the mother connects to the brain of the baby. So I have an MRI scan on the slide showing the parts of the brain that are connecting when mother and baby are actually involved in sending oxytocin to one another or connecting to one another, the oxytocin level raised. When you get hugged, you calm down, oxytocin is released. Eye gaze, if anyone has ever breastfed or was breastfed or seen someone breastfeeding, the eye gaze is one of the very strong connectors. One of the things we use in therapy for clients is that they look at one another, that they connect. If it's a safe environment, that the husband and wife or the boyfriend and girlfriend connect through the eyes, because this brings us back to attachment style, to the mother-child connection. So this is something that we use in therapy. There was a poignant story I read when I was doing research about a nun in Beirut. There was a war zone, bombs were going off, the baby was crying hysterically, and the nun picked up the baby, stared the baby in the eyes, and put her hand on the baby's heart as if to be transferring safety and oxytocin, and the baby calmed down. So we know this, that we can do this with our baby. We can do this in relationships. We can do it to ourselves. When we're about to self-destruct, when we're having fear of losing that Costco membership and that dysfunctional love version of love, we can calm ourselves down too. And the research shows that separating from the mother, separating from the breast, kicks in the distress response, that we actually are in fear. Oh my God, we're losing love, we're losing milk, we're losing dysfunctional version of love. And the same thing happens as an adult when we argue or when our partner says something, or fear of something happening in our relationship. So attachment styles. The research on attachment styles links back to secure attachment, which is safe, secure, your needs met, and insecure attachment. Relationships mean danger. There are three major types of insecure attachment, and I'm going to focus on that today. Dismissive parents create children that have insecure avoidance. This person devalues themselves and relationships. They flee from feelings, so in that fight or flight, they flight. They're clueless about interpersonal stuff. They just don't realize that they're contributing. They don't know about mirroring. They don't know that maybe what the partner is shadowing to them as part of what they have in themselves, that their children is mirroring them to them. They don't have this awareness. Preoccupied parents create insecure, anxious children. These children have severe fear of abandonment. They become clingy and needy. Ways that they can manifest in relationship is anger, aggression, or passive aggression. Remember, same coin, different side. Disorganized parents have insecure, disorganized children. These children can't focus, they can't soothe themselves, they're really distracted, they can't think of solutions, they become catatonic, paralysis, or helpless. And we've learned helplessness. So I've linked it to moon signs. There's dismissive parents create, like I said, insecure avoidant. This person devalues the relationship in themselves and flees from feelings. Many times these are the fire signs. I'm going to get into the goddesses in a minute. So I have Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, which are the fire signs, and Scorpio. Scorpio is one of those signs that kind of wants their mind read, and they don't necessarily confront what they're feeling. There's a control issue there too. Preoccupied parents create insecure, anxious children. These people have fear of abandonment and they become clingy and needy. Taurus is a very needy, materially needy, especially sign. Cancer, I can speak to, is extremely needy. That's me. A lot of childish signs, childish behavior, seeking mother everywhere, very anxious, clingy and needy. Yesterday I started pickleball with Miss Rapace, and she's like my mom, you know, my surrogate mother, and the child in me feels very nurtured and safe with her. And I had trouble when the teacher was like, find a new partner, find a new partner. I didn't want to leave her alone. It's very clingy behavior. Virgo as well, and Pisces. If you're coming on Saturday, I'm going to go in depth to the shadow side of those. Disorganized parents have disorganized, insecure children, or insecure, disorganized children. These children have difficulty focusing. They can't soothe themselves. This is very much linked to air signs. I'm talking moon signs here. Gemini, Libra, Aquarius, and I also attached Capricorn. One of the reasons that the air signs in particular are so disorganized is that they need multiples. They need a lot of, they rely a lot on their rational mind. They think their feelings out. They're not really working in the neocortex with the Athena, quote unquote. They're not thinking logically and rationally, but they think that if they think through their emotion, that they're going to get the answer. It's very disorganized and makes them all over the place like air. I call this sort of the pig pen, and maybe I'm dating myself with that reference of Snoopy. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Peanuts characters, but Pigpen always had like a cloud of dust around him. That's very disorganized emotion. They don't have discernment to know what they're feeling and how to soothe themselves. I stuck Capricorn, even though it's an earth sign, in there, kind of like where I put Scorpio as a water sign with the fire signs, because Capricorn is very much about duty and logic and rational and responsibility, and they get caught up in that they tend to not feel their feelings. Whereas the preoccupied or insecure, anxious, they feel way too much. That's where the abandonment, the clingy, and the neediness comes in. So if you want to know your sign, you can obviously ask me, or just Google moon sign on the day you were born. The only cuidado that I tell you is look and see if it's at 0 degrees. If you're born at 0 degrees of your moon sign, it could be that you're actually born in another sign, because the moon moves so quickly. The day of the moon could be 3 o'clock in the morning, one sign, and 3 p.m. in the afternoon, a different sign. So if you're at 0 degrees on your chart, make sure you're not at 0. If you are at 0, you can obviously ask me, or make sure to check the time of your birth. That will give you the specific moon sign. So I wanted to bring a little bit more mythology in, and I am going to cover this more in depth on Saturday if you attend, and how attachment styles link to the goddesses. So I didn't just put the goddesses, I put the virgin goddesses, and this is super important. These 3 goddesses were virgins: Hestia, Artemis, and Athena in Greek mythology. And why do I use this terminology? Besides that, that's what they were called. It's linked to the moon. It's linked to our attachment style, because a virgin indicates that you never grew up. Virgin indicates psychologically that you never had your menstruation, you never left the waxing phase of the triple goddess mythology. I'll share with that on Saturday. And you never became the adult, okay, that you stayed sort of virginal, childlike. And that's what the moon does. It keeps us in child. Again, this is symbolic. It does not mean that you don't get your menstruation or anything like that. Hestia was left in mythology to tend to the fires. No matter what was going on in the Greek culture, society, she was always there, left to the fires. Fire signs tend to not go very deep. They kind of just tend to the fires of whatever's happening on the surface. So therefore, these signs, not to say Scorpio is a very deep sign, but they have difficulty because of the control factor. That's why I put them in there. So these signs tend to be Hestia archetypes, insecure, avoidant, avoiding depth. Preoccupied parents, insecure, anxious children are more in line with Artemis, the hunter, the huntress. So what happened was, at birth, Artemis was born. In about 2 seconds, her twin brother Apollo was born, and she never had any chance to tend to her own needs. Her mother didn't tend to her needs, preoccupied, and this creates a lot of anxiety in the child. The signs linked closely to this are Taurus, Cancer, Virgo, Pisces, Moon. These signs tend to be very needy, very insecure, or they're overly maternal. They want to take care of you all the time, because in the psyche of Artemis, it's don't tend to myself, tend to my brother Apollo. Disorganized parents have insecure, disorganized children. These are children linked to Athena. So this is a different version of Athena, or the dark side of Athena. Remember, Athena was birthed from Zeus's head. So there's a lot of rational thoughts, there's a lot of strategy, there's a lot of thinking around Athena archetype. And these people can get consumed with their thoughts, but they never provide practical solutions or application. In the state of Capricorn or the moon of Capricorn, they might only provide practical solutions, how to manage your money, how to, draw a map, but they don't apply it in terms of the feeling, the emotions associated with it. So Athena archetypes, they like to help others, but they're birthed from the head. They tend to be very focused on the thought process rather than emotional or feeling application. So does secure attachment exist? Well, I don't think so. It's my personal opinion. This is my theory. Like unconditional love and selfless, I don't believe it exists. However, like unconditional love and self, I believe it can be achieved. This is the process of dethroning your parents. This is the process of shifting from child to adult. This is the process of taking a breath and making a choice, using that pause between the breath, like the Yoga Sutras say, God lives between the inhale and the exhale, the pause, the teenager in my model. It's the shift from in trans-theoretical model of behavior change into action and actually maintaining that action. It's not self-sabotaging. It's owning your 48 to 52 and not letting someone take over your kingdom. Saying no if you have to, setting a boundary. So is it achievable? I believe so. I do not believe it is something that exists between parent and child. That is not my belief. So now there's been a lot of research to part of the brain called the insula, which is linked to the limbic system, and it is actually linked to self-esteem. And one of the things that is showing up is that the functional imaging, the fMRIs, are showing that insula has to do with conscious desires. And remember, we are acting subconsciously. The child in us trying to get our needs met, this dysfunctional version of love, is a child. It is not conscious. It is a subconscious. The moment we move into action, the moment we stop and take the breath from teenager to adult, the moment we stop and say consciously, I'm not going to have the Diet Coke, but I'm going to choose the pink nail polish, we are reducing food cravings and drug cravings. The drug cravings and the food cravings, or whatever coping mechanism, shopping for you, gambling, whatever your parental structure was, whatever that unhealthy version of love was from your parents' buckets, shows up as your subconscious desires and the way you punish yourself when you dethrone your parents. However, if you stop and you consciously link to the insula, link to self-esteem, link to self-worth, linked to secure attachment, linked to the 48 to 52, every language I have told you, you will actually reduce the cravings, or you can shift them. For instance, I have a client whose mother would eat wheat thins. And so what did she do? She became gluten-free. Wheat is gluten. And she eats organic, she eats healthy, she eats gluten-free. That's the higher consciousness of dethroning your parent, not letting your parent show up later as self-destruction. So does secure attachment exist? In my opinion, yes. Own your kingdom, dethrone your parents, show up at a higher vibration, a higher version of your parent, and stick to your 48 to 52. Any questions on the amygdala, the hypothalamus, dethroning your parents, the oxytocin, the myths, the almond tree myths, the limbic system myths? Any question about anything? I'm going to stop the recording and take attendance.